All right, so let's talk about drawing some D&D characters. In this case, a dwarf druid. I love drawing dwarves. I love drawing druids. So I'm going to talk you through a bit of the process that I think about when it comes to creating a character like this, and things that can definitely help you in terms of techniques and what you can think about and consider to make your character more unique. So you don't end up with a very generic looking dwarf, because we don't want to mimic AI, okay? We want to be artists. We want to be more creative. With that said, I think one of the most important things that you should start to consider when you're drawing dwarves is the shape language overall. And so what this means is that you have to establish a sort of proportion for dwarves that you want to go with. It doesn't mean you have to follow mine, but I'm going to talk about mine in general, because that's the one I really like. And it's basically where we push the proportions of the dwarf to be more squarish and a bit more like compact, because my dwarves tend to be, very compact and this bulky sort of rectangular shape language that I like to use. And I like to then push and pull the features a little bit more than what you would see, for instance, with elves. So that would mean like I would really push the nose into this sort of squarish, more bulbous format. I would push the lips forward. I would have a very volumetric beard. I would push the ears. And sometimes I do these exercises where I like really just push shapes. I create very organic graphic shapes, and then I try to fit sort of these, in this case, dwarven proportions within that to see how far I can push this dwarven shape language. So for the portrait, especially because that's where you're going to get a lot of your personality in the dwarf, this is where I really like to push it. And then on the figure side, I tend to do the same. I tend to see where I can push the form specifically. And in this case, especially for me with dwarves, it's more about I tend to enlarge the hands and the feet because they're very animated. And it also makes the dwarf look more grown up than if you were to keep a small body with smaller hands and small feet, because then you almost have like a childlike body with a dwarven head on top of it. So to counter that, I tend to create bigger hands that are more expressive as well, and bigger feet. The dwarven character is specific, but also the druid class in D&D is pretty specific. It's usually like they're either shapeshifters or it's very earthbound, right? It's in touch with nature. And so this is what I use, especially in the clothing, right? I tend to keep sort of these earthy tones. I try to go for more like greens and some browns and try to just be playful with that. But also, and I think this is important, and this is where I usually tend to be a little bit more unique than what I see most people do when they draw their character, is I will make associations. So, for instance, for my dwarf, I had him as sort of a shapeshifter that maybe can turn into an owl, or at least he has like owl companions. And for me to make that connection stronger, what I actually did is I pushed his facial features to be more owl-like. So I looked at sort of the shape language that an owl has in their face, and I tried to mimic some of that in the face of my dwarf, because for me, that one made a more solid connection between him as a shapeshifter druid, but it also made him more unique as a dwarven sort of race overall, because otherwise I might end up with the same thing that everyone else is doing. And I think this exercise of association really helps you with just pushing it a little bit past what you would conventionally draw and turn it into something that might be much more entertaining or unique. And so that's what I went with here. But instead of having the regular sort of noses that are a little bit more bulbous, I went with something that resembles sort of the shape of an owl a little bit more. So a little bit more sharp, right? A little bit more down and sharp, as you would see with an owl beak. So I'm trying to sort of reverse engineer that into the nose just to get that resemblance. And then obviously with the color itself, I tried to use a color pattern that you would see with an owl in the beard. So sort of this grayish with some of those white dots that you would see in an owl. Also, when it comes to, say, the costume design, again, I'm trying to pull inspiration from nature. So nature can give you so many cool shapes already. So instead of having the same old sort of wizardy hat, right, I'm just pulling from nature and making it look more organic in the sense that, you know, maybe how branches sort of follow, or even tree trunks sort of follow a certain rhythm. I'm trying to do the exact same with this druid head that he has on. I'm trying to form, or I'm trying to follow sort of the inspiration that I get from nature. And then sort of similarly for the eyes, again, I'm trying to mimic those owl features. So I'm not going to go for, let's say, a standard looking eye. I'm trying to mimic some of that shape language that what you would see in an owl's eye. So essentially that means that it's like a little bit more open, but specifically there's just a different color on the eyes, right? So I'm just thinking about how can I use sort of this punch of maybe a little bit more of a saturated color in my art or in this character design so that it becomes just a bit more unique, I would say. So that it's not an eye like you would see on all dwarves or all druids. It's, again, just creatively using a different way of pushing the features just a little bit. Doesn't have to be a lot, but just a 10% change, you can already do so much. And so it's just an exercise of trying to find where you can push and pull it a little bit without, of course, breaking the dwarven race, right? Because if you push it too far, it's no longer a dwarf. So you have to find these subtleties where you can borrow from nature, in this case, right, if it's a druid, and see how you can still keep the dwarven characteristic, but push it a little bit more unique towards your taste or what you have in mind for your D&D character. I'm just having fun with it, just playing with it, but I think that that exercise of association makes it much more fun and creates a more unique character. And again, that can go into a cool backstory, you know. Sometimes you don't have to start with a backstory. Even if you're creating like your own D&D character, of course you have your character sheet, but you can also sort of, if you have something in your head and you can play with it and you can play with the aesthetics and you come up with something like I have with this dwarven character, you could think about what the backstory was that led to that specific aesthetic of your dwarf. So you can have all of these routes essentially, right? I do this a lot with sort of this example as well, where again, I'm just practicing dwarfs, but I'm starting with these very graphic shapes and I'm sort of trying to then make those graphic shapes into dwarfs and then seeing what I end up with. And then again, I can play with that shape language and create something that I wouldn't normally create. And that can turn into a cool and interesting character. Now, on the topic of bringing your character to life, the last thing you want to do, I feel like when you have a D&D character, is like, that's your character, that's your unique character. And in order to make that character feel more alive, you want to have the character act and not pose. So I talk about this in our figure road, but a lot of the times what character designs in general do wrong is that they pose their character, meaning that they'll have their character like stand in front of a camera as if the character is looking awkwardly at the camera and sort of not knowing what to do. Whereas if you're really good at character design, what you just do is you capture your character as if they are going about their everyday life. So you're actually just capturing them in the moment, acting out their daily routines. So that's what you're seeing here with my dwarven druid as well. He's acting out how he just interacts in general with like his owl companions. And you can do that in a million different ways, but there's like a big difference between almost having your character be aware of the camera and just making them have a stiff pose versus having your camera just capture a specific moment of what your character is doing. And if you can think about it in that context, you will usually end up with a more natural and more interesting looking character. And then again, in terms of the colors, I tended to stay just very earthy and in a sort of natural color palette. So I chose to have his outfit be, you know, on the green side, but like toned down, not too flashy, not too saturated. Sometimes maybe having some color punches here and there. specifically for when light sort of hits the greens, and then combine that with more of these earthy, cooler brown colors, or browns in general, for all of the natural elements, such as his staff, or even the owls in general, and then combine that with a skin color that also feels a little bit more down to earth, literally. So everything is not too flashy, not too saturated. Now, that doesn't mean you cannot do that. That's just what works for me and how I can keep my color palette a little bit more coherent and complementary, instead of having to really push in very loud colors that I don't necessarily want specifically for this sort of race and class. I like to usually keep it sort of down to earth, but sometimes with other classes, like let's say a paladin or, you know, a mage, I might use brighter colors because it kind of gives a different vibe, or I need to give a different vibe. In this case, I wanted to just keep it down to earth. And other than that, for me, it's more about just finding shapes that I really like, that I want to combine. And again, like I said, that sort of exercise of doing association between what I think the dwarven character looks like in general, and then the 10% that I can push it with in terms of associations that other people wouldn't normally make. For me, for instance, with the owl, combining those features, but you can find literally a million different things from nature-inspired elements, which the Druid class is, and sort of infuse that into your dwarven character or in any of your characters that you want to create. But again, this video was specific about the dwarven character and the Druid class, and I really like to work that way. So we'll definitely look at other character designs that I made with different races and different classes, and how I think about that process overall. Now, I find it important to mention, if you're new to drawing or if you're new to sort of fantasy art, don't necessarily try to rush into the final result. Make sure that you first understand the fundamental structure of what makes a head, a figure, and then you can look at how to push those proportions. That's why in Artwod we have the beginner roadmap of understanding construction, and the beginner portrait to understand the construction of the face and the features, and then we go into our dwarven road, where we really fixate on how can we use all of that knowledge and push and pull it to create some very sort of interesting overall looking designs. All right, so that's it for me. I really like this sort of character design process, so I'll definitely make more videos about this if you guys want to see it. But overall, keep in mind some of the tips that I gave you, and as always, enjoy your art and happy drawing.